Thank you very much for coming to this NATO and Hungary 2030 conference. It is a real pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Equilibrium Institute. As you might know, the Equilibrium Institute is Hungary's independent policy think tank, and our goal is to give more space to future-oriented thinking in Hungary, to have more policy debates. For that reason, we write evidence-based and consensus-seeking policy papers, and our aim is that these papers and these discussions serve the development of the country. We also like to discuss these papers with the best international and domestic experts, and our goal is to ensure that the current and future political, economic and cultural decision makers learn about our recommendations and hopefully accept and implement them. And that is also one of the reasons why we gathered here today to this joint event with the NATO. We wanted to initiate a joint thinking about the future of defense policy of Hungary, the policy goals of NATO and as a member state, Hungary. We wanted to discuss the new strategic concept of NATO, which was adopted in the NATO summit in Madrid. And also our aim is to launch a long-term dialogue between different stakeholders, decision makers, people from the think tank sphere, academics, experts. Let me start with only two numbers, 72 and 65. These are two important numbers. 72 is the percentage of the citizens who actually supports their country's NATO membership in all NATO member states. 65 is the percentage of EU citizens who are currently considers that the EU is actually a good thing for their country. Why these numbers are important is that not since 2007, so not in the last 15 years, there were so many support for EU and NATO. The European Union hasn't been this popular in the last 15 years. So if there is, after all the unfortunate events from the aggression of Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, so if there is one positive externality, it is the unprecedented popularity of EU and NATO among Europeans and Americans. And maybe for some of the guests, especially for foreign guests, it may come as a surprise, but the climate of opinion among Hungarians is pretty much similar. 84% of the Hungarians support Hungary's NATO's membership, according to the latest polls, and 60% of the Hungarians believe that the EU membership is a good thing for the country, and only 5% think the opposite. So Hungary's NATO's membership is surrounded by such high level of consensus among both Hungarian citizens and politicians that, to be honest, in the recent years there were not too much defense policy issues on the top of the political and media agenda. As there was a unanimous support, almost unanimous support, everybody believed that it is not a topic that we should debate. But when we decided a few months ago as Equilibrium Institute, and it was before the war, to hold a conference together with the NATO on the future of the NATO and Hungary, our goal was to initiate a professional debate on defense issues, to speak about issues that are absolutely underrepresented both in politics and in the media, such as cybersecurity, the relationship between NATO and China, or, for example, Hungary's national security policy strategy. And to be honest, we expected at that time, so around 1 year ago, that it will be very, very hard to, convene politicians and experts and media to one room to speak about these issues, because there are so many much more important issues for Hungary. So we believe that nobody would actually care about defense issues when there are so many things like inflation, economic crisis, in many countries, migration, and so on and so on. But of course, the unfortunate events of the 24th of February changed everything. So because Russia's aggression against Ukraine, we see it not just as a conflict between two countries, but also the beginning of a new era of security policy, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And as it is the beginning of a new era of security policy, we believe that it is crucial that decision makers, experts, start jointly to planning ahead for the next decade, as we always do when a new era begins. So that is why I'm delighted that today's conference is bringing together the best experts, both from Europe and America, both from Hungary and Poland, both from Finland and Sweden, both from the right and the left of the political spectrum, both from government and the think tank sphere. So people who usually don't sit together, it's honor to welcome all of you that and you sit together. And the fact that so many people from different backgrounds and different values and different countries are sitting together and think together about the future of NATO and Hungary is, I believe, a delicate expression of the united will of the electorate, which envisages the future of Hungary in the NATO and in the European Union. And I believe at least three questions we should discuss today when we are going to talk about the relationship between NATO and Hungary and the future of defense policy. I think we should talk about, number one, the NATO's new strategy, of course, and which, albeit with different emphasis, mentions Russia, China, terrorism as security policy challenges. We should speak about which of these three challenges will pose the greatest threat to Central Europe and NATO. Not just now, of course, we know the answer, what is the greatest challenge now. The question is what will be the greatest security challenge in 10 years' time. Number two, I believe we should talk about the forthcoming accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, which is a milestone in the alliance history. And our question is what exactly the two new members will bring to the alliance and what are actually the expectations of Finland and Sweden from NATO and its Central European members. And number three, we saw in the recent months that the V4 cooperation has essentially entered, well, a state of hibernation. So the big question, what are the chances of survival? What new formats can replace it, if there is a necessity to replace it? And also, of course, after the Madrid summit, there is the big question of if Hungary and other Central and Eastern European countries need to review or adjust their national security strategy based on the NATO's strategic concept. So these are the three questions we would like to talk with you about: the radically changed security policy environment, the accession of Finland and Sweden, and the future of the security strategies of Central and Eastern Europe. So these are the things we would like to discuss with you, and I would like to thanks again that our guest traveled here from America, Finland, Sweden, Poland, and also the NATO that it supports our event and this very important and essential policy discussion can take place here in Hungary. And now I would give the floor to Petr Lunak, who is the deputy head of the engagement section in the NATO's public policy division. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamás, for your introduction, for introducing me as well. And let me start by thanking the Equilibrium Institute for putting together this meeting, which I think, is the beginning of it's going to be not just a half a day of fascinating discussions today, but hopefully a sort of long-term debate that will continue in the future. And indeed, it's wonderful to see, not only in this room but hopefully online, people from all walks of life, politicians from various parts of the political spectrum, but also journalists, think tankers, and so on and so forth, because that's what actually makes the real strategic community and ideal environment to discuss security and defense policies. I will, in my I've been asked to lay out the main results, the main takeaway from the Madrid summit, and a few thoughts on the new strategic concept, which I will do in 10 minutes. I have, because I will not bore you with long presentations, but I'll try to, nevertheless, to somehow outline what I think is what we think in NATO is important, the main takeaways from the recent meetings. We have just a historical Madrid summit. We always say that NATO summits are historical, but this one really is. For a number of reasons, and basically the context is very different. We have witnessed tectonic shifts in international politics. The sort of demise of what we used to call international liberal international order. Great power competition, something that we saw coming for quite some time, but now really, and frankly, the rise of China and the current war in Ukraine launched by Russia are the concrete examples and consequences of that. But first, let me say a few words about Madrid. And in this context, I think there were 4 important decisions taken at Madrid. The first thing is, of course, Ukraine. We will step up, or we are stepping out our support to Ukraine. We provide unprecedented levels of support. We have been in Ukraine, actually training and supporting Ukraine since 2014. Since the invasion in February, NATO allies actually stepped up that support even further, and we just launched something. Upgraded actually something that exists for quite some time, comprehensive assistance package, or CAP. We like all these acronyms, which actually the main purpose is to help Ukraine move from Soviet era equipment in specific concrete terms to more modern NATO standard equipment, helping them also to build security and defense institutions in Ukraine. The main point here is that NATO will provide support for as long as it takes. No one can exactly predict when the war is over. But what we know is that the more we are able to provide support, the more support we are able to provide to Ukraine, the probability that this conflict can end on terms acceptable to Ukraine is actually higher. And this is actually our role in the concept: uphold Ukraine's right to self-defense while not being part directly of the conflict. We will not be directly involved in the fighting on the ground in Ukraine. The second point is that allies agreed the most fundamental shift in our deterrence and defense policies I think since the end of the Cold War, really. Clearly, because we live in a much more dangerous world, and therefore we need to do more for our core task, which is collective defense. In fact, in the new strategic concept, that's one of the sort of semantic differences from the previous one. The core task is no longer called only collective defense, but collective defense and deterrence, which shows how different, or how the thinking and not only thinking but also concrete activities supporting it change. When it comes to land domain, the 3 main elements I think are worth mentioning. First, clearly, is more forward defense, meaning more troops, especially in the eastern part of the alliance. Of the alliance. Our presence has already increased since the invasion of Ukraine. We now have 8 battle groups. Each of them is slightly different, but this is actually a move over half a year from 4 to 8. We have actually doubled the size of these individual battle groups. We have also increased, or the idea or the plan is also to move the formation from battalions or battle groups actually to brigade level, which is something that will be considered. And in concrete specific terms, we now have 42,000 troops, mainly in the eastern part of the alliance, under direct NATO command as a direct response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This, of course, this is not the whole thing. These troops will be actually supported, in addition, by more high readiness forces, not necessarily deployed on the eastern flank or southeastern flank, but being having more high readiness forces in the countries, in their home countries, but being able to actually deploy very swiftly to where they are needed. One such example is, for example, the German initiative to have a sort of a brigade based in Germany, but which will rotate out of Lithuania. That also comes with more pre-positioned equipment. Because it's actually slightly more, and logistics expert will support that. It's probably easier to move people than moving equipment. So of course, this whole idea also means more pre-positioned equipment. The third decision, so that's the fundamental shift towards hardcore deterrence. The third fundamental shift or fundamental decision is Sweden and Finland, inviting and starting accession process. I will not spend too much time on it because we have a panel on it, and we have two speakers who are much more sort of competent to speak about that particular issue than myself. But let me just say one thing: how things can again change. Because if you remember President Putin's initiative late last year, when he suggested a new security treaty, which would actually mean no more NATO enlargement, moving back the situation in terms of infrastructure and troops back to 1997 and so on forth. In less than a year, actually President Putin, a great strategist, ended with much more NATO with potential two new members, with much more NATO actually in the east. So this much for that, but I think it's important to keep in mind that NATO's door remains open, and I think the Swedish and Finnish future membership is the case in point. Now the fourth. Of course, main takeaway is the new strategic concept, which, and again, the strategic concept which was adopted a decade ago. The differences are very clear. Although the structure and the three core tasks with some changes and updates, or the titles are different. The environment or the context could not have been any more different at Lisbon 11 years ago. Actually, President Medvedev was present. We actually said in the strategic concept from 2011 that we aspired to a strategic partnership with Russia. You will not find that sentence in the current strategic concept. In fact, we label Russia as the most direct and most direct threat to NATO. China was not even mentioned in the Lisbon strategic concept. This is now different because we address the 22 strategic concept addresses China. Challenges that China poses to our interests, to our values, to our security. Again, this is a fundamental shift. So, so a few thoughts on the strategic concept. I think what we see is a really in a way, very fundamental shift from the post-Cold War era, because in fact what I think you can I would characterize the grand strategy that NATO adopted in the post-Cold War era as the sort of three-level enlargement: political enlargement, geographic enlargement, and functional enlargement. You know, in fact, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the idea was, you know, that that the liberal order which existed in the West would somehow be that was vindicated in the West, would be expanded, you know, that further to the rest of the world in a way. Globalization, connecting economies, democratization, diffused respect for individual rights, personal freedoms, and so on and so forth. This was, I think, the very right strategy. I think it met its purpose, but it also brought instability to some extent, not by intention, but in particular in the form of ethno-religious clashes and terrorism. And in fact, in order to address these new and emerging challenges, and I apologize for using that term way too often, but you know, the best way, and I think something that worked until recently, was this sort of, you know, three-dimensional enlargement. First, political, more NATO members. You know, already during the Cold War, the NATO membership actually increased from 12 founding members to 16 at the end of the Cold War. We now have 30 allies, soon 32, and you know, and that also includes, of course, partners and different various frameworks for partnerships. Geographic out of area. You know, it was very clear that in order for NATO to remain relevant, we have to go out of area. You know, clearly the sources of instability were outside of the alliance, so we had to move and sort of address sources of instability elsewhere. And of course, functional, because NATO actually from a hardcore collective defense alliance, which it was during the Cold War, moved beyond to you know, to out-of-area operations spanning from humanitarian intervention to peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, capacity building, security sector reform, and anti-piracy. You know, a whole plethora of activities. You know, also venturing and stepping into new domains such as cyber defense, hybrid threats, energy security, joint intelligence, and so on and so forth. And in fact, you know, all these tasks were always historically added through new strategic concept. You know, through new strategic concept. Collective defense was in the first actually strategic concept, which dates back, if I'm not mistaken, from 1948 and 49. In fact, this is you know, the 22 concept is the 8th strategic concept in NATO's history. The 1991 strategic concept added crisis management, you know, clearly for the reasons that I mentioned, and the Lisbon summit, the Lisbon strategic concept added cooperative security. So there is clearly progress in that direction. However, the current situation, the current context is different. It is very different because simply, you know, international politics is no longer, which was the case after the fall of the Berlin Wall, is no longer characterized by cooperative relations. Most prominently over the past 2 decades, Russia and China and Iran have worked rather assiduously, I would say, to alter international orders in Europe, East Asia, and Middle East. And the return of great power competition actually challenges NATO's post-Cold War grand strategy. You know, let's be absolutely honest about it. Globalization is under attack. as many states, many actors actually oppose free trade, while multiple governments increasingly protect national champions and technology sectors. Democracy is receding, not only around the world, but sometimes even within the Euro-Atlantic community itself. Financial stability and macroeconomic cooperation are more difficult to maintain and have generated over the past few decades, many discontents. So the new situation is very complex, is far more complex than what we have known so far. And the nature and magnitude and extension of the changes that play in the international, make actually the document, the strategic concept, the 22 strategic document, both necessary and to some extent also difficult to elaborate and sort of develop into concrete policy. So one last point, and I know that I'm almost past my time allocation, but I think the main strategic challenge in the era of strategic fragility, let me use that term is among other things, I think the rise of China, technological acceleration, and also the existential threat of climate change. And these challenges will increasingly complicate our effort and ability to actually execute our core tasks, which remain collective defense and deterrence, crisis prevention and management, and collective security. At the same time, the old threats are still the sort of more traditional challenges, as witnessed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are still here. We have been just through a major pandemic, which again shows that military readiness and logistics can be abruptly disrupted by non-military threats. So again, something that we will have to take into consideration. One last thing I will mention is that it will impact also the sort of, the current new security environment impacts heavily on our partnerships with countries and organizations outside of NATO. So, for example, in what I would call probably intervention fatigue. There is not much appetite for large out of area operations. The question is how to address still the instability which exists. Probably, I think, and that's what some and many analysts actually argue, that it's through sort of domestic resilience. Helping partners and ourselves also to build domestic resilience. To addressing non-traditional threats, including cyber threats, disinformation, mass migration, and so on and so forth. So this again will be something new, needs or necessitates new approaches from NATO. In any case, the implication that will emerge from these shifts constituted by the rise of China, by climate change, technological change, will be strategic. And and will require more than just tactical and operational adjustments. So, what is required of all of us, current members and future members, is actually a sustained and continuous effort with the new strategic concept and beyond to move the alliance forward. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter, for this important analysis and summary of the Madrid Summit and the strategic concept. And now I will give the floor to Dániel Bartha, who will moderate today's event and who will start the first discussion. So, Dániel, the floor is yours.
Today, before starting the first panel, I would like to share some technical information. We will have 3 panels here today. All of the panels will start with kickoff remarks, and we also invited some contributors. but then we will have a discussion with the open discussion here. Please indicate when you would like to add something by choosing your name tag here. We will have 2 short technical breaks as well, but we will have to keep the time as the discussion is streamed online. So it's not Chatham House rules, obviously. We also have some journalists around the table, and also we will take questions from people from the audience at the end of the panels following our discussions. As we are a little bit behind our schedule, I would like to start the first panel focusing on the global security environment and its implication for Central Europe. And I would like to quickly introduce those who will give us provide us the kickoff remarks. First, I would like to introduce you Max Bergmann, who is the director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Prior to working at CSIS, he was a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and had several high-rank positions in the U.S. Department of State, mainly focusing on security issues and Russia. So I think this is an ideal panel for you, Max, today here. I would also like to welcome Ambassador Réka Szemerkényi, who is a senior advisor at the International Republican Institute. Prior joining IRI, she was executive vice president of SIPA in Washington, D.C., and served as the ambassador of Hungary to the United States, and also as security policy advisor of the Hungarian Prime Minister. And I would also like to introduce Márton Ugrósdy, Deputy State Secretary at the Prime Minister's Office. Márton previously served as the director of the Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade, so he's just transitioning from a researcher to a state official, but I'm sure he still has the mindset. So thank you very much, Márton, also for joining us. And let me start with you, Max, and asking questions from you on the changes of this global security environment, and my questions will focus more on the Russia angle, as you're a Russian expert. What are the implications of this conflict, the mid and long-term implications for conflict for Russia, and for Russia's position in the global security environment? And also, I would like to ask you to quickly, a little bit, brief us from the perspective of the key Russian allies, because obviously they have to reposition themselves a little bit during this conflict. My other question would like to focus on a little bit about this later stages of this conflict, that whether Russia will have to introduce any major political, military, and economic reforms, and do you expect that Russia will do that? Actually, is Russia capable to run reforms and revise its policies, change its political system as the result of this conflict? And finally, do you think that following this conflict, Russia will be capable to improve its image and retake partially its position in the among the big powers? So, a lot of Russia-focused questions for you. The floor is yours.
Well, first, thank you, Daniel, for putting so much on the table, and thank you to the Equilibrium Institute for having me and for hosting, I think, this important conference. So, I think it's important to in assessing Russia's position, I mean, it has to be updated by the events of the last few days with the Ukrainian offensive. And I think Russia's position is incredibly bleak. I think Putin has committed a total debacle in invading Ukraine. And as someone who sort of spent a lot of time working on U.S. policy, especially toward the Middle East during when the United States invaded Iraq. It has sort of all the hallmarks for me of an Iraq-style blunder in which a president somewhat arrogantly invades a country thinking that it will go very well and it will not take a lot of time. And then a decade later, the United States had to withdraw. 2 decades later, we withdrew from Afghanistan. So I think right now, Russia finds itself in a militarily disastrous situation in which, according to the Pentagon, potentially 1/3 of the force that Russia used to invade Ukraine has been chewed up, both in terms of deaths and also killed and wounded. They've lost tremendous amounts of equipment. And yet they haven't fully mobilized the country. They are calling this a special military operation. So I think militarily something has to give. Russia now finds itself in a situation where I think the only way that it can maintain its position is through some sort of mass mobilization of the country, which is incredibly politically risky. Essentially, Putin has to make a decision that was, I think, there for Americans to make in early 2003 or 6 months into the war in 2003 when it was clear that Iraq wasn't going well. Either you commit to an endless conflict that is going to cost a tremendous amount of money, cost a tremendous amount of lives, mobilize the entire society, or you don't. And I'm not sure actually which direction Russia will go in terms of the war. I think there's an assumption that Putin will just sort of double down and keep going after Ukraine. On the other hand, I think a mass mobilization of the population would be incredibly unpopular, would I think potentially threaten their survival of the regime, which I think is the most important factor in Putin's consideration of what he does next. But that's just the war. I think when we look at the impact of economic sanctions, there's a lot of debate about whether sanctions are effective or not. I think the US strategists, when they were developing a sanctions package, never thought that sanctions were going to materially alter Putin's calculations, especially once the war began. They tried to threaten it and before the war, hoping that it would dissuade. But really, once the war began, it was clear that banks don't stop tanks. However, banks can prevent you from funding the production of additional tanks. And I think one of the things that Russia is going to face is a tremendous economic crunch. In particular, the unique aspect of the Western sanctions regime is the use of export controls, of controlling advanced technology and preventing their export to Russia. Now there's going to be ways that Russia gets around this. They're going to create all sorts of cutouts in terms of companies, and like North Korea, could find a way to get certain parts and components that could maintain certain military industrial sectors. But Russia has to do this on such a huge scale. They now have to replace thousands of lost vehicles, thousands of cruise missiles, all that require advanced Western technology and Western parts and components. I frankly don't think they're going to be able to do that in a timely manner. And when you start seeing new versions of Russian cars that then don't have airbags and don't have modern technology, it raises questions about Russia's industrial capacity to replace and to fill in the Western parts and components. Import substitution sounds great in theory, but in practice, particularly given the highly integrated nature of a global economy and the advanced technology, just can't develop those sorts of technologies overnight. And so they're going to have to go to the black market. But then right now, the US and Europe are increasingly vigilant about cracking down, and China has not really come to Russia's aid economically at this point in terms of exporting. So I think they're going to have real problems in maintaining their defense industrial base, which means when we get to the foreign policy question, you look at a country like India, which right now is importing a lot of Russian oil that is highly dependent on the Russian defense industrial base for their military. India faces numerous security threats in terms of Pakistan and China. But will Russia be able to meet India's orders for highly advanced military weaponry? military weaponry that Russia actually desperately needs to use on the battlefield. And if you're looking at making a future procurement, why would you buy Russian? The Russian material has not not proved perhaps as effective as Russia would hope. This is not a good advertisement for the Russian defense industrial sector. And I spend a lot of time talking about the Russian defense industrial sector because that is critical to Russian foreign policy. So when you start kneecapping Russia's defense industrial base, you're also kneecapping a crucial element of Russia's global position. Then let's talk about energy. And I think Putin is now using the lever that he has against Europe, and he's using it with great effect. This is why the United States had pounded its head against the desk when meeting with German officials to not go forward with a Nord Stream 2 pipeline, to not be dependent on Russian gas. But that said, yeah, Russia is going to cause causing painful energy price spikes in Europe, and that will be the case at least over the next few years. But what I would say is two things. One, Europe is showing the resilience of democratic societies and its ability to adapt and take evasive action and to do what it takes to get through this crisis. And I think we've seen that we've gotten through the past few years of COVID, of basically shutting down our economies, and that rich Western societies have an ability to be incredibly resilient. Now, Russia cutting off its gas doesn't mean it can sell that gas elsewhere. There are pipelines that it needs to ship that gas to Asia or to liquefy and turn into LNG don't exist. It's going to be perhaps a decade before it can potentially ship that gas from its gas fields to China. So what that means is that Russia is basically just depriving itself of potential economic revenue from its energy sales. So I think in general, this is a catastrophic blunder, the invasion of Ukraine. It's one that I think will only get worse and further impact Russia's strategic position negatively. I think it will lead to Russia being increasingly isolated in the world because there's going to be little reason for many countries to actually engage with Russia besides energy purchases, which will be important, but it's, compared to what it's had, I think amounts to a tremendous strategic defeat. So is Russia capable of improving its image? I think the only way for Russia to really improve its image is for it to end this war effectively by pulling out, which I think in the short term would have a disastrous impact on Russia's image, but in the long term would then potentially enable a re-engagement. And the last thing I'd say is the United States has continuously found a way to engage with Russia diplomatically, even at the lowest points of the Cold War. And given Russia's nuclear arsenal and given Russia's potential security threat, I think I could see a path back for Russia diplomatically to at least re-engage in some sort of diplomatic engagement with the United States and the West. But that is contingent on this conflict and Putin not choosing to pursue an endless war. So I think it remains to be seen what decision he makes. But I think no matter what, this decision is going to be, the decision to invade will be looked back as a grand strategic blunder.
Thank you very much, Max, for this thought. And now I will turn to Réka to also by a little bit reflecting to Max's words, because could be a crucial momentum for the West can be also a potentially crucial momentum from China, replacing Russia when it comes to defense procurement as well. What do you think about the Chinese reactions of the conflict? Also, I would like to ask you to talk about a little bit about the U.S. presence in Central Europe, how long-term it is. We've seen so many times when the threat level increased, U.S. returned, but then we always heard about the Asia people that U.S. is the long-term threat for U.S. is in China, and they will never plan to return for really long term because of the importance of that threat. And also, finally, I would like to ask you a little bit to focus on angles that you're really specialized in the past years, the cyber angle and the energy angle, because what is much less visible for us, although we all expected this will be very much more on the front line, is the cyber elements of this conflict. We don't see large-scale cyber attacks on Western institutions. We know it's there somewhere, but it's much less visible than it was originally expected. How do you see that, and how do you see these threats a little bit more from a Central European perspective as well?
Thank you so much, Daniel, and I am a little afraid because I think these questions that you outlined would be kind of covering a whole week's discussion. What I would like to, if I can choose and prioritize from among the many issues that are important, is probably taking on from Max has just been finishing up, which everything that you said I think is very thought-provoking, insightful, and I very much enjoyed that, and I very much agree with a lot of points. I would like to sort of, following up on that, see the relevance of all of this for Central and Eastern Europe in the first place, and then we can of course go into the details of various aspects. And previously we used to say let's talk in Telegram style. I think now we say let's talk in Twitter style. So I have 5 points to discuss in Twitter style of the most important strategic developments that I think are having a shaping, a forming impact. To start where you left off, Russia, from this point of view, from Central East European point of view, I think because of these many problems that you very rightly identified with the Russian strategy, with the Russian tactics and military capabilities, we have to really do, which is partly ongoing, but we really have to do a very serious reassessment of Russia's situation in the world and Russia's impact on the world. And I think we have to see this clearly, the gap between Russia's military capabilities, political aspirations. And I think that gap is very telling and very important. One of the most important new developments, strategic developments for Russia, I believe, in addition to this sort of clarity over the gap of capabilities and ambitions, is the loss of Russia's strategic positions in the world. It's massive. You alluded to it in many ways. I think, if you take a look at what positions Russia built up very carefully through investing a lot of money in Europe, in Western European organizations, institutions, sports clubs, media, you name it, over the last 20 to 30 years is impressive. And I thought that was really effective as well, in many ways, in impacting on European opinions about various conflicts in the world, in various parts of the world. Now, all of these positions are gone, and they are, if not gone, then definitely less useful than any time before. Your question on Asia relates to that. The big question, how does China and even in many ways India relate to this change in Russia's position, or in this as a result of this conflict? Well, if Putin's theme was before that the West is failing and the future is Asia, and that was sort of his notion, what we have seen is that although China and Russia have not condemned the invasion and not agreed to imposing sanctions, they have not been shipping any arms to Russia. They have not been militarily giving any support to Russia, and they profit from cheap oil and maybe hopefully for them in longer-term gas as well. But both have really criticized, for instance, Russia's move against the nuclear sector and in threatening the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So I think that shows that there is a second layer of more strategic thinking. And if we take a look at what every strategic studies students have to start with, Sun Tzu, and Chinese strategy about how to go about reaching goals, everything that Russia is doing is against the Chinese strategy and logic. So there's just nothing, not one point that the Chinese would be impressed with, to say the least, in the situation of the last 6 months. So that's for point number one. Point two, for Europe. Ukraine to start with. A key development, a key strategic development, which I think has to be understood in its right position, is that a new national identity was born as a result of this war. This new national identity was the weakest point of Ukraine's sovereignty and independence before, because it was challenged on various grounds. It was challenged because it was weak, it was mixed, Russian and Ukrainian, double in many cases, or even, the pro-Russian identity in Ukraine was seen as a very powerful presence in decision-making and opinion-making. Now, this unclarity about Ukraine as a nation is over. I think it's very clear that even the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine feels Ukrainian. And what is this what are the real important, strategically important characteristics of this new Ukrainian identity? First, first, it's based on a betrayal by a Slavic nation. It's a very profound, important fact. Secondly, it's framed by hatred and anger. It's based on a very serious existential threat experience. So if we see all of this, what we can declare, I think, with fair confidence is that the idea of Pan-Slavism and this Slavic cooperation is over. That chapter is not going to sell easily. But also because these experiences that are taking place in front of our eyes are so powerful for an entire generation or two generations, growing up. I think it's not an exaggeration to assume that these very solid experiences of who are our friends, who are supporting us, who do we get, support from, political, not just military, but even political and rhetorical support is crucially important, because they're going to impact on the Ukrainian national identity for the next 100 years. So for all of us in Europe, we better know that we have a new friend at our border who is ready to fight. I'm going to go into the next one, but who is also very clearly identifying new friends and new foes. And that, I think, if in the Hungarian experience, what they are living through now is the combination of 1848 plus 1856 and 1990. I think it's like probably all of these experiences. Central East Europe. Bullet or Twitter number 3. Central East Europe is in a wholly new situation as a result of this war, because Central East Europe stepped forward. Until now, if we have been to international negotiations in the last 30 years, there was always a kind of a secondary citizenship, so to say, in the Western organizations. Yeah, of course, you have to learn about this, you have to learn democracy, this institution, that institution, you have to learn of how we function. So there was always this, even after 3 decades, you could feel that in many ways. Now, I think Central Europe stepped ahead. Central Europe is in a position of proposing strategic initiatives. They have done that. Many of the countries have done that. Their strategic initiatives are taken seriously and are being considered. They are shaping NATO strategic decisions and documents. So I think Central Europe stepped up, and Central European countries have a different, not only have their previous understanding and strategic analysis of the stability of Russia and the stability of their region have been proven right, which I think is a point to take. But also from this position on, they are in a position of equals and of contributors to common security. And my last 2 points, Twitter points, Europe. So Europe has gained a new member, a new de facto member, okay? Even whenever, the de jure membership is going to take place, the partnership with Ukraine is foundationally important for Europe. So that, I think, is a whole new look on the Eastern Front of the European Union. Secondly, which I think is equally important, something that we have always criticized about Europe is that Europe is not able to act strategically in the world, right? We have been saying, oh, we joined the European Union and we have no foreign policy, and this soft diplomacy with aids and support is like, okay, but it has its limits, and Europe is not really a strategic actor. Well, Europe has expressed very clear strategic positions and has made very strategic decisions on how to support Ukraine, how to go forward. And so I don't think that this is going to stay forever, because of course it was under an extreme duress on Europe, but that showed that in an extreme situation, that thing does exist. So I think we have to understand that Europe is in a different position from this moment on anymore. And lastly, transatlantic relations, my last Twitter point. In the 3 decades before February 2022, we have been through, I'm an Atlanticist, okay, so I've been working on Hungary's membership in NATO, I've been supporting this, I just thought that was the most important historic step that we could do, and parallel to, of course, to the EU membership, but I went through personally also a number of international discussions, conferences, meetings, informal, formal, whatever, with a continuous questioning of the relevance and the content of the transatlantic cooperation and of NATO in particular. We were continuously having to explain, to why it is important, why it will be important in the future, why it has been important, how it has to change, whatever. You, Peter, we met in the early 90s, right? From then on, it's a constant topic on your discussion agenda, I'm sure, on mine too, as well. This period is over. I think NATO's rationale is clearly there. Article 5, the power of Article 5 is shown by nothing more powerfully, by nothing than the 2 new members joining Finland and Sweden. I think I've always missed them from NATO meetings. I'm super happy that now we're going to have you at the table. I think it's very important. So the questioning period is really past. We're over. Which is super important for your question, and I will finish here, because how do we see the future ahead of us? We've always thought that Central Europe and the European continent in general is seen, the rise of China which was seen as a potential threat by Washington. There was a continuous discussion that, okay, but Europe can sort of stay out of it. It's a great power confrontation that is looming ahead of us, and we can stay out of it, and the US is going to handle it similarly to the way they were handling, the Soviet threat before 1990. I think, personally, the ability to respond to the rise of China is not going to be possible by the US alone. So even without this security situation, it was increasingly clear that the US needs Europe as a strong partner and ally in the international organizations, in international decision-making, in a plethora of forums. Now, I think it's even more clear. And our argument was for a long time that first, before we start the next great power confrontation and this next great power challenge, we'll have to get European order. And that's why, the EU-US relations are superbly important. Now it's absolutely clear, and it's not just us Europeans saying it, but I think our American friends are also of this similar opinion. So last thought, what is over is the post-Cold War era. And I think we will look back on this post-Cold War 3 decades of peace and harmony and cooperation and international development and understanding and love as a golden era. And I have a name for it. I call it JEPSC, the golden era in between strategic confrontations. So I think we're heading now towards that. And so with this, thank you for the invitation, and great to do this discussion. I'm super happy to launch this, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Réka, and thank you for this excellent Twitter thread. Thank you. And also thank you for preparing the ground for the hard questions of the Hungarian state official here, sitting next to me, Márton. Because Réka mentioned that Central Europe took the initiative within the EU together. But where is Hungary in this initiative? How do you see that? How do you see the implications of this war in Central Europe due to the different threat perceptions what is the future of regional cooperation based on the current situation, and what does the Hungarian administrations or government thinks about the threats coming, and how do they prepare for them? The secondary impacts of the war, such as the economic crisis, migration, instability in the south. So, what is the plan?
It's a work in progress, actually. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And as Danny mentioned, I'm just transitioning from think tank to government, which is really easy because I cannot have an opinion anymore. So let's see how it goes. First of all, I think both Max and Réka were right that we have to seriously reassess that what kind of threat Russia poses to Central Europe. We used to think that the Russian military is 10 feet. Told everybody who knows the RAND study that they're going to run over the Baltics in 60 hours. I think there's time for a serious reassessment there. And I think, ironically, if you say this also underscores the Hungarian position, that we should be a bit more patient to see that what comes out of this. Because I don't really see Russia running over Europe and ending in Lisbon because they just don't have the physical means to do so. And it also means that the threat assessment that we've been supporting in the past couple of years, that Russia might not pose a direct security challenge to Europe and especially NATO because of the institutional safeguards, is something that we have to take seriously, but not accept the fact that Russia is out there to invade Poland or the Baltic states next day. And ironically, the success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which started a couple of days ago, shows that maybe Russia is not what we used to think it is. The second point about our threat perception is the physical distance we have between Hungary and Russia. And our Prime Minister said a couple of years ago that we must have something in between Hungary and Russia, and if it's Ukraine, it's even better. But the point is that we do understand that countries who have a direct border with Russia, like Poland or the Baltic states, have a significantly different assessment. And I'm quite sure that if we had something on our borders like Kaliningrad, we would have a different threat assessment as well, but we don't. We have 1,500 kilometers between us and Russia, which changes our strategic outlook a little bit. Having said that, I think the Hungarian government has been very consistent in reinforcing our defense capabilities. I could talk about the military modernization program that has been running for a few years, and the first results of that are just being realized with the arrival of the self-propelled howitzers a couple of days ago, or the main battle tanks that we've been acquiring from Germany, and so on and so forth. So we're on the way to meet the 2% commitments as they were designed in the Wales Summit in 2014 in a couple of years. So on that front, I think we can be proud of what we have achieved. Of course, Hungary is a small country, so relatively the number of units and forces that we'll be able to put on the field will be smaller, but that wouldn't prevent us to provide help to our friends and allies, just as we've deployed the Hungarian Air Force to the Baltics, to Lithuania a month ago. And they're going to participate in the third rotation of the Baltic Air Policing mission, by the way, intercepting Russian jets flying in and out of Kaliningrad as we speak. So we do understand the different strategic concerns of our neighbors, but at the end of the day, I think in that sense, we're pretty much the prisoners of geography when it comes to how we look at Russia and whether we think it is a danger and what kind of danger it actually poses. Secondary implications, my Twitter feed might be, 2/17 or something like that. I will try to be quick. Secondary implications. I think we can say without any doubt that a prosperous, stable, and peaceful Ukraine is in the interest of Hungary because it's our neighbor. It's not going to go away, and we wouldn't like to see a failed state or an unsuccessful state on our borders because that would only radiate insecurity to Central Europe, and this is something we have to tackle. And in that regard, I think reinforcing NATO and telling everybody that the eastern flank is united and we're up to the challenge to protect NATO and our allies is very important, and I think the Hungarian government has been very consistent on this. And in line with that, we have been supporting the membership of both Finland and Sweden when they have decided to join. And I think Hungary's support for NATO's open door policy will remain as such as it used to be in the last 20 years. And of course, our focus would be to bring in more countries from the Western Balkans because that's another point of tension in the region which has to be addressed in the near future. But in that regard, NATO enlargement will remain crucial. Now, what we can say about regional cooperation in defense industry is another question. You've been seeing that Hungarian companies have been investing in abroad in small arms and aircraft and other industries. And I think if we could have some kind of an enhanced cooperation in this field, that could be very useful. But obviously, this is a business process as well. And as such, it does not only have to do with defense and security concerns, but with other dimensions as well. The economic crisis, quite an easy question. I think there's a bit of a disappointment that just after we started out to come out of the pandemic-induced economic crisis, and the economy has been rebounding with unprecedented numbers, I would say, we have entered a new economic crisis because of the the primary and secondary impacts of the sanction. Of course, we can debate that who caused this and why and what are the points. But I think the most important here is that we have a crisis at hand which we have to solve, whether we like it or not, and whether we like those who have caused this crisis or not. And in that sense, I think we have to adjust that what kind of economic actions we're taking against our opponents. A very knowledgeable person said to me once a few months ago when I was still in the think tank sector that the way how European sanctions against Russia were designed was to prevent the war, to convince Putin that it's not worth it. But now that we actually have entered the war, nobody has adjusted the sanctions. So we might have to sit down once again, look at what hurts us, what hurts Russia, and come to some kind of an agreement that how we can address the legitimate concerns of Central European countries on the one hand, and how we can assure that we will reach our strategic objective on the other hand. Not thanks, but as an impact of the economic crisis, we do see that social tension in Europe is growing, and I'm quite sure that many of you have been following the Swedish election to some extent, and we have an election in Italy coming up, and it's not sure that the political landscape will remain as it is right now, and we cannot deny that the economic crisis has a serious influence on that. And in that regard, I think we really have to we really have to assess that what we have caused and how we can address these challenges together. Once again, we're in this together. We're member states of the European Union and NATO, and as long as we remain member states of the European Union and NATO, we do have some commitments to these organizations, as they have some commitments to us following the treaties that we have signed upon the accession. Migration, I could talk about this for ages. I think this is also being securitized as we speak. So the Hungarian defense forces are in a very delicate position because they have to protect the border in the south with all the technical equipment which is down there, and they have to field police and law enforcement and other forces to control the border. And at the same time, they have to be deployed to the east of the country as part of NATO reassurance missions. So compared to the size of the armed forces we have, this is a significant challenge, but I think so far we've been doing very well in that. Western Balkans, regional cooperation. Regional cooperation, a final point because I'm running out of time. This is really interesting in a sense that the security dimension has been taking over the discourse, obviously, since the 24th of February. So how we interpret the relationship of Central European countries is only through NATO and only through that how we can defend ourselves. But at the same time, all the other problems and structural issues and debates that we used to have with each other and with the European Union and different outside players have not vanished. They've become less important, but just as you look at Poland and the frustration of the Polish government that the different rule of law procedures and other infringement procedures that have been launched against Poland in the last couple of years have not been addressed or lifted or eased by any means, despite the fact that what kind of support Poland gave to Ukraine and the Ukrainian refugees and so on and so forth. As a result of that, I'm not surprised that Prime Minister Morawiecki is pretty frustrated. And he's been talking very harshly about the European Union recently, questioning that whether Poland would like to seek to maintain the current level of cooperation with the different European EU organizations and organs. So I think in that sense, those problems that we have swept under the rug might come back with a vengeance if the expectations of certain countries in the region will not be fulfilled. And that could be also one of the reasons that the regional cooperation, the axis of evil, if you wish, from certain points of view, might come back sooner than expected, because these frustrations remain. And as the economic crisis will hit different countries of Europe disproportionately, these frustrations might be even stronger in the future. So let me stop on this very positive note, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, it's sort of suggesting some regime change in the region as well, when we would like to return some of our partners to the regional cooperation. Thank you very much. We will continue with our contributors. We requested two or three speakers to speak very shortly and comment what was discussed so far from their perspective. In this panel, we invited to speak first András, Rácz, Senior Research Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. András, I will ask you to comment what we've heard so far. Obviously, I will not ask you to comment much China or India, but how do you see the current situation?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity of being here. Kind of a methodological remark in the beginning. Everything that I'm going to say here constitutes solely and exclusively my own personal opinion. So it shall not be taken as an official position of any kind of state or institution. True. Still, I always keep saying it, and I will keep saying it. Three short things, or two short and one not too short, but still within the time limit. So as our title is like NATO and Hungary 2030, 2030 gives us the time span we need to think about. And my first point here, kind of Twitter sentences, just to learn from Réka. First, there is no way back to the status quo ante, period. Even if the war ends tomorrow, there is no way back. It's an illusion to think that peace or even a ceasefire would bring us back to the status quo ante. No, changes seem to be, even if not permanent, at least long-lasting. Changes for the NATO, changes for the post-Soviet space, and changes for Russia herself. As Max explained, long-lasting damage is getting inflicted to Russia, mostly by the Russian elites themselves. Still, this is not something that could be turned back. So there is no way back to the pre-February 2022 era. Second, I mean, for me as a Russia post-Soviet specialist, the second big change and lasting change I see is that the disintegration of the post-Soviet space is likely to continue and going to speed up. Basically, it's the end of the Ruski Mir, as Max already said. This is the end of the time when Russia could use soft power in the post-Soviet region. We see the Eurasian Economic Union breaking down. We see Kazakhstan starting a very interesting experiment under President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. And we see basically even Azerbaijan and Armenia becoming more and more, gaining more and more freedom of movement or freedom of action from Russia. And I mean, just as Réka said, limits of Russia's power are becoming apparent and will become even more apparent, particularly when the oil sanctions will kick in. Because Russian economy hasn't yet suffered the hardest blow. I mean, we need to remember, and András can talk a lot more about that, the oil sanctions, the sanctions against the Russian oil sector, I mean, exporting to Europe. Sanctions for the crude oil will kick in from the 5th of December, and sanctions for the oil products will kick in only from early February next year. That will be the time when Russia's power potential will really start dropping. I mean, from the whole post-Soviet region, basically Belarus remained the only country that is still on Russia's side, albeit not voluntarily. So I think we might soon start speaking about something like a post-Soviet region, because the post-Soviet region that we knew it from 1991 on is coming to an end. And my last point here, probably the most important point, it's about Russia. And I'm in a lucky position speaking after Max and Réka, because I just need to continue what they started to say. My point here is that Russia will remain a major systemic threat Russia will remain a disruptive and obstructive player of the international environment, even if its conventional forces are bleeding out in Ukraine. Note, not all the conventional forces are bleeding out in Ukraine. Yeah. They still have a lot of reserves. Even if something happens to Vladimir Vladimirovich right today, the Russian elites remain the same. The whole anti-Western mindset of the Russian elite is systemic. It's not going to change. So even if something happens to Putin, we're not going to have a blue-eyed liberal emerging on power. We will have somebody quite similar to Putin. Yes, with a change in the Kremlin, the freedom of movement of the Kremlin, freedom of maneuver of the Kremlin will become a bit wider, but it's a mistake to expect structural changes. And when I say that Russia remains a major systemic threat, yes, its conventional forces are suffering in Ukraine and will suffer more. But the nuclear power potential remains. The energy exporter role and the leverage and the ability to use energy export as a leverage will prevail. Its membership in the United Nations Security Council, permanent membership, it also prevails. And we need to note that if we look at the UN Parliamentary Assembly, not all the countries are against Russia. Russia is not that isolated as we would like to think. Approximately 2/3 of the UN countries are not condemning Russia. Many of the countries are just trying to wait out the storm, sit out the storm, and see what's happening. So we must not believe that our own opinion or our own opinion bubble characterizes the whole world. It doesn't. And besides, even if Russia is losing its conventional military forces, a lot of other disruptive potentials remain. Info operations supported by artificial intelligence, proxy forces, intelligence operations outside of Europe. These all will prevail. Yes, in Europe, we managed to downgrade Russia's intelligence potentials, but it's not the case for the other parts of the world. Yes, sorry, in Europe and in the transatlantic space, but not elsewhere. And my last message here, the most important one. As Russia said, as Réka said, that there is a gap between Russia's capabilities and ambitions. Dear colleagues, this gap is not stationary. This gap is changing. And Russia will surely learn and adapt. Remember the war in Georgia. Remember 2008. Yes, the Russian army defeated the Georgian army, and thereafter everybody was looking down at the Russian army because its performance was disastrous. But they learned from the experience. After 2008, Russia kept learning, and the result was the Russian army that we saw in the Crimea in 2014. They are already learning from the war in Ukraine, from the 7 months of war in Ukraine, so we must not underestimate them. Yes, right now they are not performing as they try to perform, but this doesn't mean that we'll stay down on the floor. They will learn, they will adapt, they are already doing it. And as a lesson here, we need to dedicate a lot more resources to study and understand how Russia is adopting herself. Why? Because Russia is becoming an increasingly closed, an increasingly secretive regime. It's going to be much harder to work as a Russia expert because we're going to get a lot less information than we did before. So we need to use new methods, innovative methods supported by artificial intelligence, sometimes ugly methods. Just give you one example. Since the beginning of the war, the Russian state administration has been hacked to pieces. Several terabytes of data have been hacked out from the Russian system. We need to dedicate massive resources to analyze that data because that provides a unique insight into how the Russian system works. But we need resources for that, we need people for that, we need to work much harder on it because we are going to know less and less from the insides of Russia. So we need to really focus on that gap mentioned by Réka and how that gap is changing because the strategic threat, the systemic threat will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, András, very much, and also thank you for inviting our next contributor, suggesting for inviting for comments. Our next contributor will be András from the Institute for Strategic and Defense Studies. He's a senior economist, an expert on Russia, and I would ask you about the economic angle. How much import sanctions will kick in, how much technological sanctions will kick in Russia. And we have already heard from our speakers that we will have a couple of very hard years coming from Europe. how many years? What is your estimation about that? How deep will be the crisis in Europe?
Okay, thank you very much. I was a little bit surprised to be invited because I have not too much to do with NATO in general. So I'm an energy economist. And I very much agree with Max that, of course, the consequences of the sanctions will be disastrous for Russia. But what I brought to you is the last question of yours, some numbers regarding the European implications of the situation. The first and most important may be that there is a misunderstanding and confusion. We don't differentiate enough between financial and energy crisis. Financial crises happen very often. On average, they take 1.5 years, and the fast recovery comes after that. Well, energy crisis, we don't have too much comparative basis. Well, the 70s need structural adaptation. This takes half a decade. Often I hear from government politicians, oh, that's too much, from opposition politicians with joy. But still, it is a much longer period what we should be ready for in terms of a crisis. So it started in 73 in the oil industry in the 70s. We were coming out of it by 78 when the Iranian Revolution and the Iraq-Iran war kick in. So be a little bit more. Energy crises are longer and deeper in their implications. Well, I will skip the issue of oil. It is very bleak, but I would like to speak only on natural gas. If the Russian supplies stop and do not restart again, so this is the most pessimistic scenario, we will lose 12 to 13% of global gas trade, net gas trade. This is 4 years of incremental growth on the market. So there will be a gap. It would take 4 years to reach the level what we had before the war if we lose the European pipe gas. This means a deficit, a physical deficit of natural gas in Eastern Europe for the next 2 winters, a very politically, economically, very disruptive event, development. We will be on the brink of a deficit, and we don't know how to manage it. So it's a very ugly thing if a gas system collapses. So it is very difficult to manage. The high price environment, if prices remain roughly at the same level, it is 180, 200 euro per megawatt hours. This means for Germany, 35% of its GDP more outflow in the energy import bill. This is the total added value of a normal welfare economy in a year. But in Central Europe, numbers are even higher. It depends on the gas trade, of course, but it is somewhere between 6 and 10%. This means that for the next 3 to 4 years, what is expected, these governments, there will be no economic growth, real economic growth. Stagnation is the best hope for that. And what we will have is a growing indebtedness and definitely a depression. Of course, we can shorten. The deeper the recession is, the shorter the adaptation will be, but this is a very high price for adaptation, understandably. So these are the numbers what we face. I would say that it is a very serious thing, and maybe it's not an overestimation that for most of the politicians, the energy and the economic crisis will be the top issue, the primary issue. So we will have a situation when European population will blame for Russia what they did in Ukraine. At the same time, will want to stop the situation as it is. So this is a a very difficult political challenge for any political party, because there is no answer to that. To be Russia skeptical or Russia critical on the one hand, and sanction skeptical, or do something with the sanctions, the Russian sanctions, I mean, on the other hand. So there is no formula how to solve this issue. But we will have a very hybrid sentiment, a very difficult hybrid sentiment of the population, what is to be expected in Europe. That's all for now.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to open the floor for comments and questions as well, if you have any. Please indicate if you have comments, or if you would like to return to certain angles of the discussion. Please, who would like to be the first? András.
Thank you. Just one short question to András when it comes to Russia's gas export to Europe. I know practically nothing about the gas market. How flexible can Russia be in switching on and off its gas export to Europe? Thanks.
Right now, or should we go?
No, go ahead.
In the wintertime, they can cut it off fully without any problem. In the summertime, depends. So there is a segmentation on the north. Bovanenko field was designed for exports, and there is no summertime demand on the pipe from Bovanenko to the Nord Stream. So on that segmentation, they have to flare in the summertime, maybe even in the wintertime. But St. Petersburg is a there's a major demand, and they have a 30 BCMA connection to the main grid from that pipe. On the other sections coming from the Nadimpur region, I think that they can cut the gas without any problem. Even with flaring, maybe, but I don't see flaring at Suja, in Anape, around Moscow. They could flare the gas. They can cut the fuel supply even in the summertime. In my assessment, they have already almost done it, actually. So we came down from 400 million cubic meters per day to 80 now. This is not enough for Europe. So the numbers are not there already, and if they cut the Ukrainian pipeline, that will be half as much. Well, in the oil, it's more tricky, because it is oil is so a much bigger share of oil goes for exports, and oil extraction is more difficult to stop. So that's why this idea from the American administration that sailing can be introduced on the oil market is a bit more realistic, because definitely it is very difficult to stop oil production in a large scale. But as I mentioned, on the oil market, we also experience a permanent deficit already. So even a short cutback in the Russian oil exports can have very bad effects on the global market.
Thank you. Martin?
Yes, I'm going to ask a very naive question here, because we heard a great deal about like a hardship and difficulty related to cuts on Russian supplies. Do you see any positives in us liberating ourselves from dependence on these energy sources, tightening the belts, and in 4 years' time, without any dependence on Russian gas and oil, wouldn't be a positive perspective to look forward to?
Thank you. I think it would, but I don't know who wants to give a feedback on that. Márton, okay.
Thanks a lot. The question is fair, and the standard answer to that I've heard from the Americans all the time is the security costs money. And I think the money we actually talk about is visible in the utility bills that we are going to pay later this year. And András was right in saying that if you cut Russia out of the global gas market, you will have a global shortage, about 12 to 14%, you said, on the global market. So even if you scale up production elsewhere, it won't be readily available because there's a market gap to fill first. And I do not know that whether we will have the physical capabilities to bring this gas to Europe, especially to landlocked countries like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and the Western Balkan countries. Poland is obviously in a better position thanks to the LNG terminal it has built and the different connections it has started to develop, for example, with Norway and so on and so forth. But once again, geography, we linked up to almost all the neighboring countries when it comes to our gas system. But the problem is that all the gas we can buy, except for Croatia, is Russian gas, from Slovakia, from Romania, other places as well. András might prove me wrong on that, but source diversification is still not there. Of course, it would be great. It would be wonderful to buy gas from Qatar and Australia and God knows whichever place, but we don't have the physical means to bring it here. And I do not see where the money will come from to pay for all those huge infrastructural investments that we will need to have physical access to the global LNG market. Because if you don't have money to pay the utility bills for government buildings, for that instance, would be pretty much interested in seeing that how you can put an additional $2 or $3 billion into a new LNG terminal, which is not even in your country. So you need enhanced regional cooperation for that as well. So I'm a bit less optimistic on that, but obviously if somebody is willing to foot the bill, we can talk about that.
I was just going to add that I think when it comes to sanctions, I think part of what has happened is, sanctions initially, prior to the war, there was not a perception that there was going to be sanctions on the energy side. That was not in the kind of Biden administration's thinking. But I think the way the war has evolved, that this is Putin's lever. And so, if Russia still wants to sell gas to Europe, I think Europe should be willing to buy that gas. And I think that is why I sort of commend the German government in not giving the sort of excuse to Russia by withholding turbines and other aspects to keep the pipeline going, that essentially this is Russia violating and breaking the contracts. And I think Europe should be willing to buy gas if Russia is willing to sell it from Russia because of how crucial it is to Europe's economy just structurally. But that isn't the case. If Hungary can buy Russian gas, I think that there's no prohibition or sanctions that would prevent that. I think this is the lever that Putin is using, and so I think we need to be clear that this isn't the cause of sanctions. This is the cause of Putin weaponizing the energy resources he has against Europe, and that was always the danger of being dependent on a supplier like Russia, which is why the United States was very adamantly against, for decades, the notion of Europe being completely dependent on Russian gas. So, but I think the bright side, the positive side, is yes, gas supply is going to be, I think, a huge challenge over the next few years. But we are also entering an environment and world where suddenly renewable energies and technologies, while not being able to replace gas fully or replace other forms of energy, are cheap. And so I think this is incumbent on Europe to expedite the energy transition and also the industrial development of clean energy technology. So hopefully the deployment will be brought forward. There could be changes to some of the permitting processes to move some projects, to accelerate projects that were taking forever. And much of this is also being discussed in the United States suddenly. So on the one hand, I think hopefully there'll be lots of investment in the clean energy transition. And I'm curious, András, what your take is on the prospects there.
I just would add two comments on this. First of all, so I don't know what is the alternative. So what is happening is happening, and I don't see the way how it can develop in another way. This was more or less a one-way street after the war broke out. A lot of depends on Moscow, of course, but I don't see how it can develop in another way. So definitely we will have at least the technological possibility to import from other sources than Russia, everywhere in Europe, in a 5 years' time. And much of that volume will be lost. I also agree. And in this regard, yes. So we will have a strategic autonomy. Putin will not be able to, Putin or whoever comes after Putin, will not be able to use this as an economic leverage. On the other hand, two issues. The one is that we also lose the economic leverage on Russia after the sanctions. So sanctions is a one-time weapon. I don't know, of course, the effects can be disastrous on the Russian economy, but in a 5-year time, there will be a situation when only tough talk will work on the East. There will be nothing else. Maybe the situation will such that anyway, only tough talk works. But we lose a possibility to speak with people in Russia in a more mildly way in the future. I don't know how what it means for us. And the second argument is just a small one, that we lose a bit of competitiveness in Europe. So natural gas prices have been significantly lower than in the Far East in the past. And I don't see any other reason for that than Russian pipe gas. This has been lost. So there will be a long-term loss, small loss in competitiveness in Europe because of the disruption of this relationship. That's it.
Thank you. Mr. Lunak and then Réka.
Sure. Many thanks for the floor. Just one comment and one question. In fact, it brings me back to what Mr. Rácz said. You know, we have been all sort of, I think, impressed by the Western sort of unity and reaction in response to the conflict. But in fact, if you look at beyond the sort of the Western bubble, the balance sheet is not that impressive, because indeed, you know, in the UN General Assembly, if memory serves me right, out of 193 member countries, 141 condemned the invasion. But those countries actually only represent, if I'm not mistaken, 40% of the world population. So, you know, and in fact, what worries me more is not the countries that somehow voted against, because that is, I think, altogether 5 countries. You know, with Russia, it's the usual suspects like North Korea, Eritrea, you know, Syria, and Belarus, of course. You know. But what really is worrying is the abstaining members, and you have actually countries such as India, you know, Mexico, South Africa, you know, countries that somehow you would expect value-wise be closer to us. My question is really. What is behind it? Because I don't think that they actually they support the invasion, but they see it as something that is not their problem. It's something that is you know, distant. Why should they make their life more complicated than it already is? And my question is, in particular to Max, but also to others who, you know, follows India. I mean, is this a sort of something long-term tendency of the, you know, within the world community, or is it something, you know, particularly particular to this particular situation? Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a great question. I think it depends on the individual cases. I think there was a number of countries that were abstaining because of economic interests, some because they just wanted to stay out of it, others because there's a resentment towards actions and others that have been taken by the United States and in other countries, and wanted and have relationships with Russia that are important to them. So I think that, you know, with India, I think is the example that most people will be following. I think a lot of focus on the United States because there is a huge incentive now and desire to have a strong U.S.-India relationship, and that spans multiple administrations. Really, the George W. Bush administration sort of rekindled the U.S.-India cooperation. I think there's a sense of acceptance of that. Look, India is dependent on Russia for its military. It needs Russian arms shipments. And instead of demanding and jumping up and down that India condemn, I think there's more of a quiet approach. And my guess is that where India will go in the following decade is that when it looks to make arms procurements, it's going to look away from Russia. Already the United States arms sales to India has gone from 0 to more than $10 billion. But India doesn't want to be entirely dependent on the United States. They were the subject to U.S. sanctions after their nuclear tests. And I think that means there'll be more arms sales to Europe. They'll be looking to other Asian partners. And I think this is sort of hints to a longer term problem. Certain countries were dependent on Russia, didn't want to anger them at the UN Security Council. Also, we have to remember when that vote happened, it was unclear how the war would go. So I think the major thing for Russia is that over the longer term, its ability to maintain many of its economic relationships outside of oil, I think is going to be really put to the test. And I think that will maybe countries will not want to get involved in Ukraine, but it means that the intensity of the relations, at least on the economic side, will be hindered. That said, Russia has demonstrated an ability through the use of private military contractors, the Wagner Group, to prop up certain leaders in Africa, to find a way to insert itself in a number of countries. And because Russia seeks to be a global great power, it will continue to look for ways to maintain relationships that annoy everyone in the West, France, the US, the UK, and others. So I think Russia will remain a major challenge. The last point I would just make, and this is off of a point that András made, that I think when it comes to China, I think the Chinese have played this very well in that, were supportive of Russia and supportive of the invasion early on, but then now are just not eager to be subject to potential secondary sanctions, are holding back potential support. And then I think when we think about the United States and China, I think one problem is for Europe to consider is that part of the poor military performance by Russia will be used by a number of people inside the US government to say we don't need to worry about Russia, which I think is a mistake. I think Russia has demonstrated that it's always close to being a great power, even when it is dismal militarily. And so there could be a tendency over the next few years for the United States to actually reduce its presence, reduce its force posture in Europe, focus much more on Asia because it sees the threat from China diminished. And I think that's just another point to add to the conversation as Europe thinks about what its posture needs to be toward Russia going forward.
Thank you, Max. Réka.
Yeah, just one point on how important the energy element, of course, is in the entire consideration behind the war. I believe that this European decision of going towards the green transition and phasing out increasingly the carbohydrates out of the energy sector was a very important element for considering when to launch an attack against Ukraine, because that is very clearly, that was announced to be like within the next 5 years that the European usage of natural gas would be seriously declining. So absolutely clearly behind that point, the influence of, or the dependence of the European markets on Russian natural gas imports would be drastically different. So what is happening, obviously, is a question that Márton raised. Is it going to fasten up, really, the green transition? Is it going to lead to a refocus, which I think is in the discussion now? And the question is, how to get from here to there. So that is the sort of the very sensitive, 2 years ahead of us, in which absolutely a serious number of investments will have to take place into into various sectors of the energy field. But and of course, especially the winter ahead of us, a couple of degrees minus will make a huge difference in gas consumption, and plus as well. So I think it's going to be a very tough winter for the European economies for sure. And I believe that this is the biggest challenge that we have to face. How to handle this couple of months that are ahead of us, and how to manage the public opinion. So I think the biggest challenge, which goes with it and which has been raised in the discussions. And so the big challenge is, going forward, how to capitalize on the previous experiences and build a consensus, or maintain a consensus in many ways.
Thank you, Réka. Indeed, it seems like the next couple of years will look like that. Winter we will looking for more gas, and in summer times we will probably complaining about climate change. Tamás, you indicated you would like to add, and probably this would frame the discussion for the first panel well.
Thank you. Yeah. I will intentionally simplify what you said, but I would like to put 3 statements here. One, you were talking about that this war is gonna end with a disastrous result for Russia, both in terms of image, international image, and also in terms of military maneuver. Number 2, András, you said that, and the others also emphasized, that Russia remains with us also as a disruptive power in the region and maybe beyond the region. And number 3, you said that Russia is still needed as an important energy supplier, especially gas supplier for Europe and the world. And if we see this kind of triangle, like a disastrous image and a weakening power, but still a disruptive power and an important energy supplier, then the question goes that if you were to advise a Central European country, Hungary or others, what to do in this triangle, what would you recommend? So how to play in this field when you are dependent of Russian energy, but and you are also close to Russia geographically, but you are part of a transatlantic alliance. So if you were to advise a government, what would you say?
Okay, I think, since this is your official position, Márton, you can.
Yeah, I'm not advising the government anymore because I work for them. I very much like the argument that energy is a matter of morals, that we should buy from countries that we like. Well, I don't know if anybody checked the recent rapprochement between Venezuela and the United States. Not as if human rights have changed that much in Venezuela recently. But you have market forces, you have gas prices going up, you have people being discontent with the stature of the economy. And I can very much support what Max said a couple of minutes ago, that if Russia is willing to sell gas to Europe, we should buy it, because right here, right now, we don't have any other alternative. We can, of course, talk about that, how we're going to invest and what's going to happen in 5 and 10 years, but that's not going to get through this. That's not going to get us through this winter. That's one thing. The other is obviously the so-called global West that we're all part of. This is a decision that has been taken a couple decades ago. I don't see that changing anytime in the future, in the near future. So in that sense, certain responsibilities come from that. And I think when it comes to responsibilities and the joint decisions of both EU and NATO, Hungary has been supporting, of course, voicing its concerns over certain elements of what the EU should do and how it should do it. But at the end of the day, there was a consensus, and many, many measures have been passed in the past half a year. And the third point was about the strategic concerns. I think on that front, we're in a good position, if I may say that, as part of the strongest alliance of the world. And thanks to NATO, we shouldn't be worried that much about our physical security, but obviously that doesn't mean that we don't have to do our homework. We have to spend more on defense, we have to be smarter, we have to be more resilient, and so on and so forth. And my final point would be what András Rácz said about whether the Russian position is static and whether it's going to change. Of course it's going to change. They're learning quickly. And I think it's foolish to expect that if we diversify away from Russia in the next 5 years in the field of energy, they're not going to diversify away from their markets. And my favorite example, and I'm going to stop here, is that by the time we have been debating whether Nabucco should be built, roughly from 2006 to 2010, the Chinese have built an entire 4,000 kilometer long natural gas pipeline to Uzbekistan. Europe wasn't even able to agree on who should be the chairman of the company. And the Chinese have put 4,000 kilometers of pipes on the ground. So I wouldn't underestimate this prospect in the future. And what András said about the leverage, the economic leverage we have over Russia, that's not for granted. I mean, of course, they're thinking and they're investing as well as at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we have no more comments for this panel, I'm sure we will continue in the future panels, these questions. So thank you very much for joining the first panel, and after a short break, we will continue. Thank you.